कि प्लीज़ आप अपने मोबाइल फ़ोन बंद कर दीजिए और ऐसा ना हो कि दौराने जो लेक्चर होगा इनका आप यहाँ बैठ के अपने मोबाइल से सुने या उठ के बाहर जाएं सुनने के लिए। तो बेहतर है कि बंद कर दें क्योंकि बहुत डिस्टर्बेंस हो जाती है। आपसे ये इंतजार है प्लीज़। It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor McCartney. Who has flown in this morning from Lahore to be with us and to give this talk on CPEC, Sustainable Economic Growth and Industrial Policy in Contemporary Pakistan. Professor McCartney is Associate Professor in the Political Economy and Human Development of South Asia at the University of Oxford. He has previously taught Economic Development of South Asia at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He has taught and lectured all over the world. In his own words, he says, "During this academic journey, I have had the pleasures and frustration of teaching in South Korea, India, Pakistan, Denmark and Japan, and working with the UNDP, USAID, World Bank and EU in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Bangladesh, Georgia, Egypt and Bosnia." So you see that he has an academic foothold as well as a consultancy foothold in many, many regions of the world. He is a prolific writer. His research, according to his biodata, examines the political economy of microeconomics in India and Pakistan, in particular economic growth, investment and the role of the state. He is the author of many, many books. Most important for us is his new book, which will appear this year, which he has co-authored with the Pakistani economist Al-Ghazali, and is being published by Cambridge University Press, entitled New Perspectives on Pakistan's Political Economy, State, Class and Social Change. And as Professor McCartney himself says, his work is distinguishable from other contributions on South Asia because it is comparative in nature. However, he feels the need for greater prevalence of other countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and South Asian studies at Oxford.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I kind of usually thank somebody at the beginning of a talk like this, but I met so many distinguished members of the Governing Council that if I was going to kind of run through the list of thanks, I think I'd get to the end of my talk without getting on to CPEC. So, Doctor, perhaps I just maybe thank you and through yourself, the rest of the Institute. I'm delighted to be here. I've been coming to Pakistan regularly for more than 15 years, but I've not in that time come enough to Karachi, so I hope to spend more time in Karachi, perhaps sitting this side of the intimidating bank of microphones and listening. I think this is looks like a wonderful spot to spend time in, so I do hope to spend more time here in the future. Then that very kind introduction. So I'm an economist. My academic discipline is economics, but I work in Oxford in a department of area studies. So we believe, perhaps less in disciplines, but we believe that our starting point is the region. So within area studies in Oxford, we teach Latin America, Africa, China, Japan, and so on. And I work in the South Asia part of area studies. So our belief is in the importance of the region. When I arrived in Oxford about 8 years ago, our South Asian studies were very much focused on India, as is true of a lot of South Asia programs around the world. We've made a big effort to change that in recent years. We've shifted away from India towards a South Asia program. So whereas we used to teach just the international relations of India India, the economics of India, the politics of India. Our focus now is truly South Asian. So we've really lifted the presence of Pakistan studies in Oxford. We have a number now of dedicated scholarship programs for students from Pakistan. So it's I'm proud to say that it's not possible now to come and study India in Oxford without hearing a lot about Pakistan. And that's one of the great values of, one of the great pleasures of teaching in Oxford, is to talk about some of these very difficult issues, Kashmir or nuclear politics, and to have Indian students and Pakistani students in the room debating those issues. So this year I have a research sabbatical from my university, and I decided during that time to research CPEC. People are getting much more interested in CPEC. I've been asked to speak about CPEC a few times, and coming to Pakistan over the course of 15 years, I've really noticed a transformation in Pakistan. When I first came to Pakistan, a lot of the discussion, it was about the IMF, it was about structural adjustment, stabilization, about the US. And now increasingly over time, I've noticed much more interest, focus on China. More Chinese scholars coming to conferences in Pakistan. So it's something I haven't just observed from the academic, it's something that's been very much a personal observation, this rise of China. So, we go to the next slide. Apologies, I'm an economist by background. Economists are not noted for their artistic and creative side, so you'll have to excuse my rather low-tech and not very attractive PowerPoint, but hopefully it's informative, if not very aesthetically pleasing. So this is going to be the plan of my talk today. I'm going to start off, I'm going to introduce the Pakistan case study. So I'm going to just give how I perceive broadly Pakistan's economic story since independence. And this is important, I think, because I might sound pessimistic about CPEC, but what I would say, I'm not pessimistic about CPEC, I'm rather optimistic about Pakistan. And I'll explain what I mean by that at the end of my presentation. I'll give some background, I'll talk a little bit about what motivated me to do this research project, CPEC. I've spent time in China and Pakistan. I'll talk about some of the problems I faced in doing this research. I'll talk about how one of the ways in which I'm studying CPEC is to look at history, the history of contemporary studies of big infrastructure projects. Then I'll look at three ways or three criteria by which I'm thinking about how to measure the likely success or otherwise of CPEC, and then I will conclude. I'd say my conclusion is, it may sound a little bit like I'm pessimistic about CPEC, but in reality I think I'd like to say I'm optimistic about Pakistan. Okay, so Pakistan case study. Pakistan is not a failed state, Pakistan is not a failed economy. Now those bald facts appear as quite a surprise to many people, I'm sure perhaps not in this room, but maybe outside of Pakistan. I would label Pakistan, it's certainly not been a miracle economy since independence. It's not on a par Taiwan or South Korea or China over the last 3 or 4 decades. But Pakistan has been a resilient economy, Pakistan has been a stable economy, perhaps surprisingly, and Pakistan has been, over the last 70 years, a moderate economic success. In 1947, for example, 99% of Pakistan's exports were agricultural goods. By the mid-1990s, 80% of Pakistan's exports were manufactured goods. Pakistan has had average growth over 70 years of 5% per year. So not quite on a par with South Korea, Taiwan, but better than much, or if not most, of the rest of the world. Pakistan has had no lost decade of economic growth like Latin America. Pakistan has not had long periods of negative economic growth, as has much of sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, according to World Bank data, Pakistan has not had an economic recession, a year of negative economic growth, since at least 1960. So there's a puzzle here. Pakistan's economy has not failed, rather it is a remarkably resilient economy. Pakistan has also, perhaps maybe not the 1990s, but been reasonable at translating that economic growth into reductions in poverty. And Pakistan today is a middle-income country, middle-income economy, with a GDP of somewhere around $320 billion. So that's my Pakistan case study. That's the big picture of Pakistan, the context at the back of my mind that I will return to at the end of this lecture. So a little bit of background, China-Pakistan trade. Pakistan was one of the first countries to recognize China in 1950. During the 1950s, though, Pakistan was very close to the US. China and Pakistan first signed a long-term trade and commercial agreement in 1963. China was instrumental in financing and helping with the construction of the Karakoram Highway in the 1960s. So the more recent initiatives towards CPEC, so the free trade agreement that was signed in 2006, and the CPEC, which was around 2013, that was formalised. These are in many ways building upon and extending earlier initiatives. So for all of the excitement in the media, CPEC really represents the culmination of much longer term economic and political relations between China and Pakistan. But I think that's important, as I'll mention. One of the perceived advantages of cooperation with China is China's commitment to a long-term relationship, something the US has been criticized for as coming and going from Pakistan. So the perception of a long-term committed relationship is important in thinking about the likely success or otherwise of CPEC. This is CPEC. So this shows the road, the railway, the energy projects, the deep sea port of Gwadar in southwest Pakistan. CPEC was first estimated to cost around about $46 billion, of which 70% was scheduled for energy, about 20% for roads and railways, and about 5% for that deep water port. And in the last couple of years, the cost of CPEC has been estimated at slightly more than $60 billion. This is how CPEC fits into a much bigger picture, the One Belt, One Road, or the New Silk Road initiative of China. So CPEC is a corner of, or a spur of, this much greater project. So I'm an area studies economist, as I mentioned. Our method is to look in depth at particular regional or country case studies. We teach in Oxford, we teach Pakistan through anthropology, through politics, through economics, through history, through languages. And that does have its advantages, an interdisciplinary, in-depth look at a particular country or region such as Pakistan. However, a weakness of our method, a weakness of my own research, is that there is a lot going on with the One Belt, One Road outside of Pakistan that could be of crucial importance for the way CPEC functions. So I've just given a paper in Lahore focusing on Western China, and I made the case that what is happening in Western China could be very important for the functioning of CPEC. So for example, if Chinese firms, textile firms, are migrating to Western China, ready to export to Pakistan, this could be of crucial importance for the viability of textile manufacturing in Pakistan. But for the sake of this lecture, my focus is on Pakistan. And I realise this has its advantages, has its disadvantages. So my motivation for studying CPEC, it appears to be a very large project. $60 billion, that is a large multiple of the $7 billion Pakistan received in foreign investment between 1970 and 2001. This is also a very interesting case study, with many scholars, many commentators that talk about the Washington Consensus, the free market Anglo-Saxon model of development, dominant discourse, perhaps being replaced by a new Chinese way of running an economy promoting economic growth. So perhaps we could think of CPEC as a case study in the difference between a free market Anglo-Saxon model and a Chinese development model. I think CPEC is also interesting because a lot of scholars talk about inconsistency and uncertainty of policy making in Pakistan, whereas commitment to CPEC has now lasted through 4 different administrations. So Musharraf, the PPP, the Muslim League and the PTI have all been committed to some form of CPEC. It's quite interesting though, stepping outside of Pakistan. So among Indian scholars, among US scholars, a lot more concerns are voiced about CPEC, about its motivations, about its viability. And I think this is also finding a very interesting case study because this is a very large donor-funded project in Pakistan. And we know Pakistan doesn't have a very successful record in implementing donor-funded projects. One example, Pakistan has had some 12 agreements with the IMF and has only fully completed one of those agreements. In terms of my particular focus in this research, I'm an economist, so I'm very much focused on the economics. I'm focused on the implications of CPEC for investment, for employment, for exports, for economic growth. The traditional, let's say, macroeconomic variables. So I look at the very broad aggregate picture. So I'm not, for example, although I acknowledge it's very important, looking at the more micro or fieldwork side of CPEC, so the impact of CPEC on livelihoods. Research of big infrastructure projects in India points out that those individuals who get jobs as a result of infrastructure projects are usually very different people from those who have lost out on livelihoods by the construction of infrastructure. So the impact on livelihoods is important, but is not something I'm really touching on in my own research. And I'm also, my own research, I'm more focused on infrastructure, so I'm more looking at the roads and the railways rather than, for example, energy. I think the importance of improving energy supply in Pakistan is very clearly demonstrated. A lot of good studies looked at the economic cost of load shedding and lack of energy supplies in recent years. So I think the improvement of energy projects as a result of CPEC will give Pakistan a boost. But I think if we go back to the 1990s and 2000s, before the recent energy crunch, I think when Pakistan did have enough energy, Pakistan was not growing at very rapid rates. I think energy is important, but it's not enough to ensure sustainable economic growth in Pakistan. And then finally, some of my colleagues who look at international relations argue that an economic focus on CPEC is really missing the most important aspects of CPEC. So some international relations scholars, for example, say CPEC is not really about the economic. CPEC is about China and international relations, about China wanting to get control or influence over the deep sea port of Gwadar. Indian scholars, US scholars talk about the string of pearls, this network of potential military naval bases running from China all the way through to the Middle East. Other scholars have interpreted CPEC in terms of Chinese energy security. So instead of oil being imported to China around India through the Malacca Straits, the oil potentially with CPEC could come directly from pipelines through the Middle East, through Iran and Pakistan. This is not particularly my area of expertise, but there is a lot of writing, a lot of debate on the international relations of CPEC, whether Chinese New Silk Road is something that a generous outward-looking project, or whether it's much more concerned with boosting Chinese economic power. That debate is one largely confined to international relations. So some of my scholars, IR scholars, say the focus on the economic is really missing the key, what's really important. So the potential or the problems I've encountered in doing this research. Well, one problem is that a lot of CPEC projects are being constructed in areas that for geopolitical reasons are quite sensitive, in which it is difficult to do fieldwork, like Baluchistan, Kashmir, and in China, Xinjiang. So we lack a lot of on-the-ground data about what is happening to livelihoods and so on from the construction of those projects. The financial data regarding CPEC is not very apparent, not very transparent. So it's often a case that rather than looking at project reports, the World Bank has become much more open and transparent in recent years. Rather than looking at project reports to get the detailed financial numbers, one has to rely on much more anecdotal and newspaper evidence to find out what interest rates are being charged, what are the terms and conditions of the repayment period, whether there are any guarantees the Pakistan government is giving to Chinese investors. Another problem with doing this research is that in some senses we're trying to guess about the likely future of CPEC. CPEC was only agreed in 2015, so we're only 2 or 3 years into CPEC. So although some of the energy projects have been completed, the big infrastructure projects, the roads and the railways, are still at early stages of construction or even at the planning stage. So we're trying to guess about the likelihood of infrastructure projects, many of which have not even been started in terms of construction. And then, final problem, as I noted earlier, I'm doing an in-depth case study of CPEC in Pakistan, but I'm very readily aware that the success or otherwise of CPEC will be strongly influenced by what's going on in countries around Pakistan. As I mentioned, if Chinese manufacturing firms relocate to Western China, they could provide a ready competitive threat to Pakistani firms. So how, my proposed methodology, how am I proposing to undertake this research? Well, one problem with evaluating the success, likely success of CPEC, is that quite clearly different groups within Pakistan seek to get different things out of CPEC. So for China, China sees CPEC as being part of its new Silk Road, creating a Eurasian or European, Asian super trading bloc. For much of the Chinese military, and various military have come to present in Oxford, the idea of CPEC as contributing to security or strengthening Pakistan's relations with China is going to be very important for the military. Some civil servants I've spoken to enjoy the fact that relations with China are liberating them from a perceived dependence on the IMF. And I think quite clearly, again, much more anecdotal evidence, that a lot of politicians have looked to CPEC as a way of getting patronage resources that they can channel to political supporters. So in a big project like CPEC, where different groups think about it in very different ways, have different ideas about CPEC, thinking about, well, how do we evaluate, or what criteria should we be using to think about the success of this project, it's quite a difficult one. So for my project, I'm turning to a big government, a Pakistan government report about CPEC, and using their own claims or aspirations for CPEC as a way of evaluating its success. So this is a quote from a government report from 2017 on CPEC. The CPEC, says this report, is a growth axis and development belt featuring complementary advantages, number 1, collaborative mutual benefits, number 2, and 3, common prosperity. So those are the 3 criteria I'm using to evaluate the success of CPEC. Complementary, are China or Western China and Pakistan, are they complementary economies? Number 2, mutual, are they both going to gain? Number 3, prosperity, is CPEC going to give a big boost to economic prosperity? Those are the 3 criteria I am going to use. CPEC is in its very early stages, and a lot of the big infrastructure projects are still under planning, still under the early stages of construction. So one way I'm undertaking this research is to turn to big infrastructure projects in the rest of the world, so historical projects and contemporary projects. And there's quite a lot of good studies of big infrastructure projects in the rest of the world. I'm looking at those projects, I'm thinking, were these projects a success? If so, what were the reasons for those successes or the reasons for those failures, and what lessons can we draw from those studies for the case of Pakistan? This, I'm not sure if you can see it over there, this is a preliminary list of some of the big railway projects in the historical and contemporary world. So that is actually, in global terms, a relatively small infrastructure project. Look at this, 19th century US, almost 200,000 kilometers of roads in 40 years. China, 27,000 kilometers of roads in 11 years. So a lot of big railway projects. That's not a comprehensive list. So looking at those projects, looking at the studies that evaluate those projects, and thinking about their relevance for Pakistan. Similarly, this is a list of big road building projects, slightly less than 1,000 kilometres of land under CPEC over 15 years. The scale of some of these other road building projects. In China, in 15 years, they built 35,000 kilometres of road. So a lot of other big studies of infrastructure projects, and I'm going to draw from these and think about lessons for contemporary Pakistan. So this is a slightly light-hearted historical whirlwind tour of big infrastructure projects. This is a picture of Shanghai in 1990 and Shanghai in 2015. Shanghai turned into a much more colourful city.
Could you bring the mic closer?
Shanghai obviously became a much more colourful city over that 25-year period, rather grey city in 1990. But what in 1990 was very important? In 1990, the government of Shanghai approached the World Bank and asked them to consider funding a metro system. The World Bank in 1990 said to the government of Shanghai, metros are not going to be viable in Shanghai. Instead, the government of Shanghai should focus on improving bicycles. Thankfully, the government of Shanghai ignored that advice, went ahead and built a metro system, and by 2015, by some measure, distance travelled, number of passengers and so on, Shanghai had the world's biggest metro system. Now that metro system drove economic growth and transformation in Shanghai. That metro system enabled the movement of people, which enabled the density of economic life that you can see in Shanghai. So that is an example of a big infrastructure project that drove economic growth. This is a historical example of another big infrastructure project. This is somewhere in Britain. This is a Roman road constructed about 2,000 years ago. Now, the purpose of building roads in the Roman Empire was to move the Roman army very quickly around the empire. So the purpose of this construction was military. However, an unintended consequence of road construction was the fact it allowed Roman culture, the Roman language, the Roman way of life to spread right the way around Europe and North Africa. So the stated purpose, the intended purpose was military, and unintended consequences were the spread of economic growth, the spread of a Roman civilization. This is another example of a railway system that, at least initially, was primarily built for military purposes. So particularly after the 1857, everyone calls it, the Mutiny or War of Independence, the British takeaway from that was that the ability to move the British Army very quickly around South Asia had been key to them winning the 1857 conflict. The initial motivation of railway construction, like the Roman example, was military. To move the military very quickly around South Asia, to go to the border with Afghanistan quickly to meet a perceived Russian threat. Now, the unintended consequence of railway construction, argue many scholars, was the deindustrialization of the South Asian economy. It's quite a contentious point, but nevertheless many scholars have argued this. that the railways made it easier to import British manufactured goods. They made it easier for British India, to export agricultural products. This was also, of course, intensified by British policy, which meant that all the technology, all of the manufactured goods to build the railways had to be imported from Britain. But the stated purpose, the intended purpose was military. Unintended consequences of big infrastructure were de-industrialization. This is kind of an iconic image from Japan, the Shinkansen, or the bullet train in Japan passing Mount Fuji. These bullet trains, construction started in 1960. The intended purpose of bullet trains was to integrate the Japanese economy to promote rapid economic growth. And that is more or less exactly what the bullet trains did. In the 1960s into the 1970s, Japan had probably the fastest burst of economic growth that's ever been experienced by any country in peacetime. So the stated purpose was economic, and the outcome was very positive in economic terms. This is a very different sort of big infrastructure. This is a replica of St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, built in the home village of an African dictator in the 1980s. This is in Côte d'Ivoire. The dictator Houphouët-Boigny built this at the cost of $600 million in his home village. Now, the purposes of this big infrastructure project were not economic. This was about the glorification, the grandiosity of a single individual. Now, the burden of building infrastructure projects like this contributed to economic problems in Côte d'Ivoire, and I think even today, income, the GDP per capita in Côte d'Ivoire have not reached levels that they were at in the early 1980s. So the purpose of this was non-economic, and the outcome contributed to economic disaster. This is some of the remnants of the 2004 Greek Olympics. Again, a big infrastructure project. The purpose of this, international relations, the prestige of Greece, a high-profile international event. And in those terms, this was enormously successful. The Greek Olympics in 2004 were highly successful. The Beijing Olympics in 2008, the UK Olympics in 2012 drew a lot of lessons from the Greek example on how to run a successful Olympics. So in terms of its stated aims, the Greek Olympics, this big infrastructure project, was a great success. However, in financial terms, this was a bit of a disaster. It cost a lot more than had been expected. 2004, 2008, the Greek economy plunges into debt crisis from which it is still struggling to escape. So a kind of a success in international relations terms, a kind of failure in financial development. So from this whirlwind tour of historical infrastructure, we can draw a few important lessons. Big infrastructure can promote economic growth, as the example perhaps of Shanghai or Japan. Big infrastructure can undermine economic growth, such as the example in 19th century India. Big infrastructure can have the intended effects. It can also have completely unintended, unpredictable effects. So I'd say my key takeaway from that historical whirlwind tour is that there are no universal lessons from big infrastructure. And we need to think about each infrastructure project separately as a case study. And this is, I think, one of the key rationales for my research, why an in-depth study of CPEC is a valuable piece of research. I'm turning to historical studies and contemporary studies of infrastructure. Now, one of the advantages of these studies, a lot of them have been undertaken in recent years. Right? They've used a lot of new developments in statistics, in econometrics, some very fascinating studies, for example, looking at satellite imagery of light density. Now, in somewhere like Pakistan with a big informal economy, the data on on economic growth is perhaps quite uncertain because of the presence of the informal economy. However, we can overcome that to some extent by looking at light density. Light density is related to economic development. So studies have looked at the construction of roads and railways and seen how they have influenced the patterns of light density. So typically when a new road is developed, areas close to that road, light density gets greater, and areas located slightly further away, the light density declines. So there are lots of very good, very interesting contemporary and historical studies of big infrastructure. So my three criteria, so going back to, we have another, so going back to those three claims by the government of Pakistan in 2017, complementarity, mutual gains and significant impacts on prosperity. So the first of those, complementarity. So here, or are they competitive? So by complementary, I mean Western China and Pakistan are doing different things and there are lots of potential for trade. So an example of a complementary economy would be one area growing raw cotton, supplying that cotton to a cotton textile industry elsewhere. That would be a good example of a complementary relationship. A competitive relationship is when two economies are doing more or less the same thing. So they're going to be competing against each other. And my hypothesis is that the more complementary are the two economies, Western China and Pakistan, the more potential there is for joint gain. Now, a good example of a very complementary economic relationship was that between Hong Kong and Guangdong, province of Guangdong, in the 1980s. Hong Kong, by the 1980s, it was high wage, high skill economy, it had a lot of capital, a lot of technology, it had international marketing networks. Guangdong in China was very low wage, it was an agricultural economy, it had reasonably well educated and well skilled labour. Now that was a complementary relationship. Hong Kong moved factories, moved investment, moved technology to take advantage of labour abundant low wage China, and growth in both Hong Kong and Guangdong boomed as a consequence. I would suggest, however, maybe a technical hitch over there, I would suggest, however, that the economies of Pakistan and Western China are not complementary in that sense. I think they are more competitive than complementary. First of all, the geography of Pakistan accessing Western China is very difficult. Transport has to cross one of the highest mountain ranges in the world. Xinjiang, Western China, is large, but it's a largely desert part of China. In Xinjiang, Western China, there are only 23 million people, so a population somewhat the size of perhaps Karachi or Lahore. Xinjiang is also a relatively low-income part of China. And if one looks at the key areas or economic resources of Xinjiang, Xinjiang grows cotton, it grows fruit, so more or less exactly what Pakistan does, and the government of China have a big project at the moment to promote industrialization in Xinjiang, and they want to promote industrialization in sectors like cotton, textiles, and the production of consumer goods, domestic appliances, i.e. exactly what Pakistan is doing. So I would suggest that the economy, the economic structure of Western China looks more to be competitive with Pakistan than complementary. Second criteria, are there opportunities for mutual gains between China and Pakistan? So undoubtedly, CPEC will make markets or transport more efficient. So at the moment, goods in central China to reach the Middle East, they have to go central China to Shanghai, by ship from Shanghai all the way to the Middle East. With CPEC, it is possible goods from central China can just go through CPEC, down through Pakistan, Gwadar to the Middle East. And that route is likely to cut some 7,000 miles off the distance exporters need to travel from central China to the Middle East. So markets will become more efficient. However, the question there is efficient at what? How do we measure efficiency? What do we mean by efficient? Efficient transport systems could mean that exporters in China find it easier to export to Pakistan. So cotton textile producers in China can export to Pakistan and maybe knock domestic producers out of business. That could be one outcome. Alternatively, maybe CPEC will not have much impact on Pakistan. So goods from China could just use Pakistan as a transit link. So goods come through Pakistan to Gwadar and then get exported to the rest of the world. Or CPEC could lead to more industrialization in Pakistan. So firms opening up in Pakistan, using the opportunities generated by CPEC to open up production in Pakistan and sell to the domestic market or export. Now, going back to those historical case studies, now one general lesson I have derived from those historical case studies is that big infrastructure leads to domestic industrialization when there is a domestic government that is committed to ensuring that big infrastructure generates incentives for local industrialization. So the US and Germany in the 19th century were very good examples of where the local government invested in big infrastructure and then ensured that that big infrastructure led to domestic industrialization. As I pointed out, the colonial government, British government in India was very different. Their big infrastructure in India promoted industrialization, but did so among British firms located in the UK. So just going to the German example, German 19th century example. In the 1830s, Germany was a low-tech, backward economy. It produced steel, but using very backward technology. When Germany started building its railways in the 1840s, it was entirely dependent on imports of iron and steel and technology from the UK. The 1840s and 1850s, a developmentally orientated German state used an industrial policy to ensure that railway construction benefited domestic firms. So, for example, the German state put tariffs on imports of steel coming from outside. The government of Germany invested heavily in engineering education to ensure that the relevant skills were available in Germany. The German government helped reform the banking system so long-term credit was available from banks for industrialists in Germany. So by the 1850s, by the 1860s, the building of railways in Germany had stimulated the growth of a domestic iron and steel industry, and very soon the key technologies such as locomotives were being produced within the domestic economy. If one looks at lessons, or one looks at the contemporary example of Pakistan, does Pakistan have a developmentally orientated state that is using an industrial policy to ensure that CPEC, the big infrastructure of CPEC, is benefiting local firms? I would suggest that in many ways it does not. So the IMF are here at the moment, and they are likely to be pushing fairly significant budget cuts on Pakistan, including infrastructure investment. There is a long-term enduring problem in Pakistan that long-term investment to industrialists has actually been steadily declining in recent years. It's very difficult for industrial firms to get credit from banks more than about 3 or 5 years, so very difficult to invest in the long-term expansion of capacity. I've had a look at some of the key government reports, such as the Punjab Industrial Strategy, and there's no clear commitment in those reports to using an industrial policy. And also, it's very clear China sees CPEC, or the New Silk Road, as a commitment not to industrial policies, but to free markets and free trade. I'm looking at other economic studies of Pakistan. Other economic studies note that there are many other significant constraints on industrialization in Pakistan that are not going to be tackled by CPEC, such as, for example, the lack of long-term credit, the very uncertain legal system, or the difficulty in enforcing contracts in Pakistan, their education system, for example, the lack of skilled labour, that there exist long-term constraints, perhaps more important constraints on industrialisation in Pakistan in areas that are not going to be tackled by CPEC. This was the map I was hoping to put up earlier. CPEC is going to be connected to. You see, it's a very long way from the high-income markets of eastern China. It's relatively poor. It has a very low population density. So my point that Xinjiang and Pakistan are more likely to be competitive economies than complementary economies. So my point there about there exist constraints on industrialization and exports in Pakistan that are not going to be tackled by CPEC. So CPEC is under discussion here. Construction projects started around here, and we can see CPEC, the free trade agreement has enabled China to export more to Pakistan, and exports from China to Pakistan have surged over the last 5 or 10 years. However, exports from Pakistan to China stagnated or perhaps even declined. I think this is some evidence to support the mention I made earlier that there exist significant constraints on the ability of firms to industrialise and export that are not likely to be tackled by CPEC. And even this relatively low level of exports from Pakistan, 80% of them are comprised by raw cotton and rice. CPEC, or free trade with China, does not seem to be promoting industrialization and the growth of industrial exports from Pakistan. So, clarity. Is CPEC big enough to generate big gains, potential big gains for Pakistan? So as I mentioned earlier, about 20% of CPEC is going to be accounted for by roads and railways. That is about $10 or $12 billion a year. So over a 10 or 12 year period, CPEC is scheduled to be responsible for about $10 or $12 billion of investment in transport infrastructure. So about $1 billion per year. That is a very small number compared to, for example, the $70 billion that India invested in its, what it's called, its Golden Quadrilateral Highway project, a big highway project to link up the 4 main metropolitan areas in India. That $1 billion a year is very small compared to around about $120 billion that China invests every year in its railway system. Pakistan scholars have estimated that CPEC will raise the investment rate in Pakistan from about 15% of GDP to about 16.5% of GDP. So a welcome improvement, but 16.5% is still a long way below the 30 or 35% of GDP investment share that is consistent with sustained economic growth of 7 or 8% per year. So in terms of those 3 criteria, complementarity or competitive, mutuality, and the prosperity, I may be sounding a little pessimistic about Pakistan. Now here are 2 dramatic examples from history I mentioned earlier. On the left is the result of deindustrialization, the construction of big infrastructure railways in 19th century India that contributed to the decimation of much of Indian manufacturing, and some argue by facilitating the export of agricultural products, perhaps even to famine in India. And on the right is the result of big infrastructure in Germany, the growth of Germany's iron and steel sector. Now, 150 years later, Germany is still the leading industrial economy in the world. Now, I do not suggest CPEC is going to lead to either of these dramatic changes. I think CPEC will have a positive impact on Pakistan. I think China's long-term commitment, demonstrated long-term commitment, is potentially much better for locking in efficient infrastructure and economic growth than the US's very short-term relationship through the IMF, those 1, 2, 3-year programs, or the US comes and goes according to its own geopolitical interests. So I think China's long-term commitment and the potential knock-on impacts in terms of project planning will be important. I think although the financial aspects of CPEC are very uncertain, I believe China has a kind of much grander commitment to its new Silk Road, and the ultimate aims of that I see as China wanting to build a new super trading bloc that links up Asia, the Middle East and Europe. And I do not think China is going to want any kind of bad publicity in Pakistan. If there are any problems with Pakistan, I would imagine that China will renegotiate or bail out Pakistan. But my main reason for what may sound like pessimism is my optimism about Pakistan. As I said at the start of my presentation, Pakistan is a middle-income country. It's had 70 years of moderate, sustained, positive economic growth of 5% per year. Pakistan, middle-income country with an economy of $320 billion. CPEC is just not big enough to make a transformative difference for a moderately successful middle-income economy of 200 million people. Somewhere like Laos, for example, a landlocked economy of $20 billion, Chinese investment could lead to a transformative change. So although I may sound a little bit pessimistic about CPEC, and I think CPEC will be positive but not transformative for Pakistan, my main reasons for sounding pessimistic are actually, I think, my optimism about the relative economic success of Pakistan over the last 70 years. Thank you. Yes,
Professor McCartney will take questions.
Talking about the World Bank in terms of project financing, I think I was just wanting to highlight the distinction that the US, the IMF, maybe the World Bank, other donors, over the last few decades have had a very hot-cold relationship with Pakistan. They were nuclear testing, they withdraw from Pakistan September 11th, 2001. They suddenly overnight come back, flooding Pakistan with assistance, and then suddenly pull out again. So I think that was characteristic of that US-led engagement with Pakistan. And I was wanting to contrast that with the perception of China as being something very different. This is something China has proclaimed, and I think for many countries, but I think there is demonstrable, demonstrable evidence that China doesn't have just a fair weather relationship with Pakistan, that it is committed to something long-term, and that perhaps that is going to be the real difference. So it's not just volumes of aid and assistance, but the predictability and the long-term nature of that aid. That was my point there. In terms of, yes, very interesting, the comparison to the Marshall Plan. I think there are some striking similarities with the Marshall Plan in terms of the size of the project, the fact it's coming from the dominant economy to the rest of the world, the seemingly quite generous nature of that assistance, the fact much of it is going into infrastructure, so some similarities with the Marshall Plan. I would say China would say there are very distinct differences as well. The Marshall Plan was going to what was really the richest part of the world, in Western Europe in particular. The Marshall Plan had a very clear political agenda. It was supposed to be warding off the threat of communism and promoting liberal democratic countries, whereas China would say its assistance comes without any sort of political conditionalities. Now, whether that's true or not, I guess is a different debate. I think, yes, I agree with the point about industrial policy, and perhaps that could be the enduring legacy of close Chinese involvement, is that policymakers in Pakistan can learn from a very good example of how to construct industrial policy. Chinese assistance could be, at that point, could be actually more important than CPEC in the long term. And China is actually a terrific example of very successful industrial policy in the 1980s, when they were opening up to the global economy. They didn't just fling open their economy to free trade and free markets. They had very strict conditions on foreign investment. So foreign investors had to come in the form of joint ventures. They had to export a certain proportion of their output. They had to source a certain proportion of their inputs from Chinese firms, and so they had to transfer technology to Chinese firms. So it's an industrial policy that made sure the benefits of foreign investment went out to promote wider industrial development. Pakistan is a resilient economy. I mean, this is, I think, one of my favourite points to make about Pakistan, because there's that perception that Pakistan is a failed state, Pakistan is a failing economy, which is just simply not true in terms of its economic data. There's a lot of supportive data. 5% average growth since independence, not having a recession, a year of negative economic growth since 1960. If one measures statistical measures of the variability of growth, Pakistan growth tends to do this. And even in more successful economies, growth tends to do this. It has higher peaks, but a much sharper recession. So Singapore is a more successful economy, but you look back, Singapore's had some very sharp recessions during its recent period. You look at the global financial crisis, 2007-8, growth slowed in Pakistan, but it was sustained through the global financial crisis. And the UK would have loved to have had this 4.5% growth that Pakistan has had since the global financial crisis. I think there's lots of variables which show Pakistan as a resilient economy. I quite often like to compare Pakistan with Italy in Europe. Everything about Italian politics says Italy should be a disastrous economy. Corruption is too high, has very unstable governments. There's always a debt crisis in Italy. It always seems to be chaotic. But Italy is one of the most dynamic and innovative parts of the European economy. So when all of the political variables seem to say that it should be an economic disaster, yet the economy still seems to do okay. So it's one of those where you look at the politics of Pakistan and it looks, you think, well, it should be economic disaster, but Pakistan is a resilient economy, not a failed economy. The oil price shocks, global financial shocks, the sanctions after nuclear testing, war on terror, all of these enormous shocks have hit Pakistan economy, but it still seems to survive and grow at 4 or 5%. Now, I think clearly Pakistan should be doing better, but I think our starting point should be acknowledging the relative success of Pakistan, not talking about failed this, that and the other. Question about Western China. I don't think Western China is depressing or doing badly. Western China in the 2000s to the present day has been growing, GDP has been growing 14% per year. It's been the fastest growing part of China. The 23 million or so people in Xinjiang in 2016 exported $15 billion. Pakistan, with its 200 million people, exports around $25 billion. So those 23 million people in Xinjiang are rapidly catching up with total exports coming out of Pakistan. And I think that is one of my concerns, that as the government of China has it perceives the ethnic unrest, the religious problems in Xinjiang, and for the government of China, the solution is industrializing, it's providing incomes, it's providing employment. And if that industrialization and employment happens in sectors like cotton textiles, consumer durables, and Xinjiang has already demonstrated incredible economic success at promoting export, mainly to Central Asian republics. If that continues, then Xinjiang could emerge as a competitive threat to the main economic sectors in Pakistan. Whether CPEC will be a game changer, well, that's the research question. I've been asking, will CPEC transform Pakistan's economy? That's the question I've been asking. I've proposed a methodology for doing that. I've defined what I mean by success in terms of those 3 criteria. I've looked, I think, at reasonable economic evidence to judge in terms of those three successes. So, I mean, I'm very happy to look at a study that makes a clear economic case that CPEC will be a game changer, but I think we need rigorous economic analysis, we need a methodology, we need a definition of what game changing means, we need evidence for that. So I'm very happy to engage, very happy to revise my own opinions if I'm persuaded otherwise. Question, Baluchistan, SEZs in Baluchistan, yes. Special enterprise zones could lead to the transformation of Baluchistan, but we have to ask the question why are SEZs in Baluchistan going to be more competitive than exports coming from Western China? Why are cotton textile production in Baluchistan, why is that going to be competitive against imports from Western China and elsewhere? There are lots of others I mentioned, significant constraints on industrialization in Pakistan, the lack of commitment to industrial policy, problems with education, problems with lack of long-term credit to industry, other constraints that CPEC, at least in its present guise, is not going to address. There are hundreds, not thousands of SEZs around the world. Why? Where is the evidence that those in Baluchistan are going to thrive? I've not looked at studies of the Tanzara Railway, but I used to live in Zambia. That's the other end of the railway. Now, one of the motivations for infrastructure development in Zambia was to facilitate the export of copper. Zambia has some of the richest copper mining in the world. I lived there in the early 2000s, and at that point, Zambia, GDP per capita in Zambia was lower than it had been at the time of independence in the mid-1960s. So I think that perhaps is a very good example if you're saying that the Tanzara Railway had big and positive impacts on the economics or the economy of Tanzania, then perhaps arguably it had a negative impact on economic development in Zambia. And I think that's one of the very consistent findings of infrastructure studies, is that they do generate positive impacts, but quite often there are positive impacts in some areas and negative impacts in other areas. So for example, studies of the high-speed train system in China. When you have high-speed trains, you don't have lots of stops on a high-speed train, you tend to connect up to big urban areas. So studies of high-speed trains say, yes, big urban areas tend to benefit, but areas between those urban areas tend to lose out. And that's, I think, one of my concerns for Pakistan, is that government reports and others tend to assume too often that everywhere is going to benefit from the expansion of infrastructure, whereas quite clear and consistent finding of infrastructure investment is that some areas, yes, gain, maybe there's a gain overall, but other areas do lose out. And in Pakistan, we might say, well, maybe Western China will gain, the already urbanized areas, Punjab, maybe Gwadar might benefit, and perhaps some of the more outlying areas may lose out. In terms of question about internal benefit, I think this was the point I was trying to make about the use of industrial policy. The big infrastructure projects, quite often when they're imposed by a colonial government, that the benefits of big infrastructure projects tend to leak out and benefit countries elsewhere. I think British India was a very good example of that. Huge amount of investment in railways, but they tended to benefit industrial firms in the UK. It was British firms that were supplying the locomotives, even the coal, the iron and steel to construct those railways. The contrary example is, say, the US or Germany in the 19th century, where they used an industrial policy to ensure the benefits from construction were retained within the domestic economy. So I think it's an open point at the moment when the CPEC projects are being constructed. Who is going to supply the cement? Who is going to be supplying the steel? Who is going to be supplying the glass in construction of those projects? Very interestingly, in all of those sectors, China is the overwhelming dominant producer in the world economy. China has huge excess capacity in all of those sectors. China can far undercut Pakistani producers in those sectors. So is construction going to benefit local producers, or are local producers going to be overwhelmed by exports from China in cement, steel and bitumen? And in the longer term, is the construction of CPEC going to stimulate domestic industrialization in Pakistan, or is it going to stimulate imports of textile goods and other manufactured goods from China? I would suggest the use of an industrial policy, historically and contemporary, is key to ensuring that the benefits of big infrastructure benefit the internal economy. Some kind of very interesting points here. I mean, talking about the BRICS, talking about the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think these are very important. I think they would have risked making my presentation perhaps even more confusing than it was. I think the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is absolutely fascinating. A lot of scholars see this as China staking its claim to replace the IMF in Asia and the Middle East and Europe. I think it was quite fascinating the way the US really put pressure on some of its old allies like the UK not to join the IIB, and the UK signed up for that. I think it's a very good example of the obvious weakening of US influence around the world. I think it's, I don't think it's had a huge impact. I think it's had a symbolic and a political impact. In economic terms, it's not had much of an impact so far. The AIB has funded a few small projects, but I think it's the potential for this to have a bigger impact in the long term. And I think that's probably why my research is not really looking at Africa yet. I don't think the scale of Chinese investment in infrastructure, perhaps Tanzara Railway accepted, is anything like on the same scale as being promised, as is being promised for Asia, Middle East and Europe. Chinese investment in Africa has been mainly focused in, there's some fascinating studies of Chinese investment in manufacturing in places like Ethiopia and Nigeria that is some very interesting studies. So I think most of the studies on Africa so far have been focused on Chinese investment in manufacturing, and I think over time Chinese investment in infrastructure is likely to increase in Africa, and I think then the African case study will start becoming more relevant for my research. The question about predators and colonialism and the example of Sri Lanka, I think, is a fascinating one. If you read reports in India about CPEC or about the new Silk Road, they invariably bring up the example of Sri Lanka. I think it's quite clear this is a core case study for the new Silk Road. I think it's about $8 billion of investment in the big new airport and port in Sri Lanka, which is coincidentally in the home village of the former president of Sri Lanka. The airport was famously called the world's emptiest airport. It was, I think, I gave some examples there of contemporary historic infrastructure where the motivation was not really economic. There was something grandiosity about it. It was about international relations. And I think perhaps the example of Sri Lanka is a good one. I think the problem is the way the Indian media or Indian scholars might pick on Sri Lanka and say, well, the whole of the new Silk Road is going to be like the Sri Lanka example. We should draw from Sri Lanka and generalize that to the whole of the new Silk Road. Chinese scholars would point out, that's just one example. There are lots of examples of successful infrastructure projects. And I think, my own method and using case studies more generally, that's one of the weaknesses of the methodology, is that one can cherry pick specific examples to illustrate one's general point. Now, I'm trying in my study of contemporary and historical examples is to draw general lessons from all of those examples of big infrastructure projects. So, for example, the point that infrastructure generally has a positive economic impact, but always has distributional impacts. Some areas gain, some areas lose, is a finding that is very general from studies of infrastructure. So I think that is a finding one can apply to Pakistan as a general lesson. But I agree with that point, that one can cherry pick examples to prove that China it's all about new colonialism and deliberately bankrupting countries so China can grab hold of crucial infrastructure. But one can point to other examples, Myanmar, Thailand, where there's been a change in government and the incoming government has said, no, we're not interested, we're renegotiating, and the Chinese government have actually stepped back and renegotiated new Silk Road projects. So I think there's examples from both, and I would be reluctant to label the new Silk Road as colonialism. I think this is a very interesting question, but one that doesn't have a definitive answer. BRICS, yes, I mean, I guess I plead I can't put absolutely everything into the research, particularly when I've only got an hour or so to talk. Am I a Sinophile or a Sinophobe? I hope I'm an academic. I'm led by evidence rather than a particular fondness for one thing rather than another. I mean, it's impossible not to have huge admiration for what China has accomplished in the last 30 or 40 years, and this is the most dramatic story of structural transformation, of industrialization, of economic growth, and economic growth that has led to some of the most rapid reductions in poverty the world has ever seen. Absolute poverty in China is maybe 0.5%, in India it's perhaps 25–30%. So I would say maybe I'm a bit of both, Chinophile or so.
Would you like to wrap up?
I'd have to pass it to you for wrapping. I'd probably wrap it
Would you
up.
like to take another question?
I'm happy to take questions.
What time would you like?
Half an hour is...
We can give it 10 minutes.
10 minutes, happy.
Okay.
I'm an economist, so perhaps you should come to the front. How will CPEC, or how could CPEC help relations with India? CPEC is not needed for relations with India. One does not need to spend billions of dollars connecting Pakistan across a mountain to Xinjiang. I've walked across the border at Wagga on numerous occasions and in both directions. The road is already there. If that border opened, it would be the busiest border in the world within the space of 2 weeks. Last time I crossed, it took me about an hour to cross, and I think 2 other people crossed in both directions. So CPEC is not needed to improve trade relations with India. It's about politics. It's about other factors. It's not about hard construction and infrastructure. That is already there. The language is already there. The culture, the history. People in Delhi would love to come to Lahore and eat Lahori food. It's already there. It's a different set of factors, I think, not hard infrastructure that would be required to improve relations, trade relations, etc. with India. With Afghanistan, I think that there has been some discussion in more recent years about bringing Afghanistan into CPEC. I think that is an example of where infrastructure would potentially be much more transformative for Afghanistan. Afghanistan is nothing like Pakistan. It's not a middle-income industrialized economy. It's a very different sort of economy. So there, I think, a relatively modest investment in infrastructure and energy, particularly if it comes with enough security to protect investors, could have a much more transformative impact in Afghanistan. But really, I'm just speculating here. I would much rather leave that question up to yourself as a scholar of international relations. So the question about CPEC and India. So concerns, if you read the scholarship in India or media reports in India about CPEC, the specific concerns they have with CPEC are that a proportion of the transport links go through Kashmir, and India argues that this is going to make it harder for a solution to Kashmir in the longer term. China sees CPEC as potentially strengthening an alliance between Pakistan and China, which changes the balance of power in South Asia. And India and also US scholars see the potential of Gwadar to be used as a naval base for China. So the Chinese Navy moving from here all the way around beneath India and being located in the Gulf. And again, these questions, I think, I've read some of the literature, but I'm not a scholar of international relations. I kind of urge other people to look at the debates for and against and better evaluate those arguments. What would I suggest for transformative change in Pakistan? My goodness, that certainly is a big question. I think CPEC is going to help, but I suspect it's not going to be the hard infrastructure of the energy. I think the most important potential gain for Pakistan for CPEC is a long-term relationship with a country that have a very different approach to industrial policy. China has accumulated long wisdom of a highly successful industrial policy, and if policymakers in Pakistan are being mentored by successful practitioners of industrial policy, rather than the IMF or World Bank coming in and out, I think potentially the ability of practitioners in Pakistan to implement industrial policy would be enhanced by that. I think you are an example of a transformative change. I think girls' education is absolutely important, although it is not enough. I mean, just educating women to sit at home can have knock-on benefits in terms of child welfare, child education and so on, but it is still, I would say, a sad fact that while 20-25% of women work in the labor force, female labor force participation in Pakistan and India is only about 20%, it's 70-75% in China and Vietnam. So education, quite often just educating a woman to acquire a better husband is not going to lead to social transformation. It has to come with the opportunities of employment, the opportunities of engaging outside the household. And one reason Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have been so successful in the last 20 or so years, why human development indicators in Bangladesh have caught up and surpassed those in India, is that millions of young women in those countries are able to get educated, exit the household and work in textile factories. Those textile factories are not wonderful in terms of employment conditions. You read about bad employment in Bangladesh and tragedies in Bangladesh, but they have transformed the lives of millions of young women in those countries, generated billions of dollars of exports, and not only in those two countries, but slightly earlier in China, in Vietnam, in the 50s and 60s in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Thailand, in the 1920s in Japan, in the 1820s in the UK. So that, I think, labour-intensive, export-orientated growth has historically been one of the most transformative factors, and I think Pakistan started it in the 1960s. That effort really stalled. South Korea, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh have done it, and I think that would be, if the new government could do anything, I think that would be a transformative change for the group in Pakistan.
Thank you, Professor Matthew McCartney, for this very fine presentation on CPEC, both its optimistic as well as pessimistic aspects. I'm sure the members of the audience were especially pleased that whatever views you may hold on CPEC, based on your own research, you have a great deal of respect for the faith in the Pakistani economy. I think we tend to overlook, when we talk about CPEC, we tend to overlook the fact that CPEC is only one of China's economic corridors. China has 8 economic corridors in different parts of the world, including one through India, which links it with Myanmar. So this is only one, but it is important for us, and as is often said in Pakistan, it is considered a game changer. It is part of a I would look at it as part of the overall development scenario in Pakistan. And it has its critics. In fact, all over the world, wherever China has started investing, there have been questions. And that is only natural, because as these projects or these corridors, as their dimensions and their dynamics become more and more obvious, one tends to raise a lot of questions. Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, raised some issues about his investment of the Chinese in this country. Many countries have done so. But that doesn't in any way detract from the fact that, as we like to say in Pakistan, it is a game changer. I hope it will be. Now, I must take issue with you on something you said, and that is about, I am a feminist, so I have to say this. That is about the women's labor participation rate in Pakistan. You know, as feminists and as those who have struggled to bring in numerous laws which are pro-women in this country, especially in the last 15 years, and have tried to put women in their proper place in the economic scenario, we have always said that that rate of women's participation in the labor force is grossly underrated. The reason is that our planners also have always overlooked the participation of women in the agriculture sector. And they have taken it as granted, as something that is related to the household, and not something that is related to the actual workforce, which contributes to the economy of the country. This is what we are fighting for now, that the planning commission or planners will relate to this concept that women play a very important part, especially in the agriculture sector, looking after animals, in poultry, in all these small areas which appear small, but which contribute to our economy. Professor McCartney has done us a great favor by being here. He flew in this morning, very early from Lahore, and he is leaving in a short while back to Lahore, and he has to catch a flight tomorrow morning for the United Kingdom.
6 a.m.
So we are especially gratitude. So I would like to express the gratitude of all our members, and I hope that you will come again when you have more time, and when CPEC has started functioning, and you have had the opportunity to assess how it is working. I want to give you this journal in which you will find the proceedings of the conference, the 70-year conference which we held in 2017. Thank you very much, and let us give him a big hand. And he served behind the